The last witchcraft murder in Britain. The tragic tale of Charles Walton. In the misty, rolling hills of Warwickshire, England, a dark and eerie tale unfolded on a cold February evening in 1945. A story that would go on to capture the imagination of the nation. The murder of Charles Walton, a seemingly unremarkable old man, became one of the most mysterious and unsettling crimes in British history. It was a crime that many believed might be the last witchcraft-related killing in the country. It was a tragedy that still reverberates in local folklore. And even today, questions linger over whether Walton's death was truly a murder, or whether it was something far darker. Charles Walton was a quiet, solitary man in his 70s. He had lived in the village of Lower Quinton for most of his life, tending to his small piece of land and doing odd jobs for the villagers. He was known as a quiet man, with little interest in the hustle and bustle of the modern world. His life was rooted in the rhythms of rural England, and though he was not wealthy, he had managed to carve out a modest existence. The village of Lower Quinton itself was a picturesque, rural community that seemed to belong to a bygone era. Nestled amidst the green hills of the Cotswolds, it was a place where the old ways of life still held sway, and superstition and folklore had not yet been entirely swept away by the tide of modernity. The villagers, many of whom were born and raised in the area, knew the land, the seasons, and the traditions that had passed down through generations. But the dark undercurrents of superstition and fear still ran deep. Among the village elders, there were tales of witchcraft, strange happenings in the dead of night, and whispers of curses that had been cast upon the land long ago. These stories were part of the village's lore, passed down from one generation to the next, and although the younger folk had long dismissed them as nonsense, there were still some who believed. As the years had gone by, many of the old customs, including those associated with magic and the supernatural, had faded into the background. The rise of the industrial age and the steady encroachment of modernity had slowly shifted the landscape of rural Britain. And yet, in places like Lower Quinton, the old beliefs were not so easily shaken off. Old superstitions still clung to the land like the morning fog, and the idea that something malevolent might still linger in the earth was not entirely out of the question. On February 14, 1945, Charles Walton set out to his usual work in the fields. He was assigned the task of clearing some brush on a patch of land near the outskirts of the village, a routine chore he had done countless times before. As he made his way to the field, nothing seemed unusual. It was a bitterly cold morning, and the ground was frozen beneath his boots. He carried his tools with him, a pitchfork, a sickle, and a cutting knife. Tools he had used for decades, tools that had become a familiar extension of his own body. It was common knowledge in the village that Walton, while an aging man, was still as strong as an ox, and capable of doing the hard physical labor required of him. He had a reputation for being methodical and meticulous in his work, and few doubted his reliability. Walton had been a farmer for most of his life, and his connection to the land was as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks that dotted the countryside. As the day wore on, Walton did not return home. His absence went unnoticed at first, as many of the villagers were preoccupied with their own work. It was not until later in the evening that the alarm was raised. A search party was formed, and Walton's body was eventually discovered in the field where he had been working. What they found was not just a man who had died from the rigors of a day's labor, but a man who had met a violent and terrifying end. The scene was chilling in its brutality. Charles Walton's body was found pinned to the ground, his throat slit in a savage manner. The pitchfork that he had been carrying was thrust into his neck, and it was clear that he had fought for his life. His injuries were consistent with a ritualistic killing. There were no signs of robbery or personal animosity. This was not a crime of passion or vengeance. The murder appeared to be something else entirely. As the investigation unfolded, the police were faced with a mystery that seemed to defy explanation. There were no immediate leads, and no one in the village seemed to know who would have had reason to harm the quiet old man. But as the days passed, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that Walton had been killed as part of a pagan ritual, a sacrifice to the dark forces that still haunted the countryside. Others believed that he had been the victim of witchcraft, the latest in a long line of victims who had been cursed by a malevolent force that still lingered in the shadows. In the days following the murder, the police questioned local residents, but no one seemed to know anything about Walton's death. Yet, there were certain oddities that began to emerge. Walton's body had been found with a sickle, a tool often associated with ritual sacrifice, placed beside him. His throat had been slit in a manner that suggested an ancient method of execution, and there were strange markings on his body, some of which resembled symbols associated with witchcraft. It was all too much to ignore. One of the first things that caught the attention of the police was the way Walton had been killed. The method of execution was peculiar, suggesting something other than the typical criminal violence of the time. His throat had been slit in a way that seemed almost ritualistic, and the placement of the pitchfork in his neck was highly unusual. It was not a common weapon for murderers, which led some to believe that the killer might have had a deep connection to the land or its ancient traditions. The sickle found by his body, a tool used in agriculture, but also symbolically tied to death and harvest rituals, only deepened the mystery. The village of Lower Quinton had not been untouched by tragedy before, but this felt different. This was no ordinary crime. Something about the brutality of Walton's death felt otherworldly, as though it had been orchestrated by some dark and malevolent force, one that was foreign to the modern world of 1945 but still rooted in the ancient past. As the investigation deepened, the specter of witchcraft loomed large. At the time of Walton's death, the idea of witchcraft was still a source of both fascination and fear in rural Britain. The country had not yet fully emerged from the shadow of the occult, and many still believed in the power of witches, curses, and dark magic. In the minds of some villagers, Walton's death was no ordinary murder. It was the result of some ancient and malevolent force at work. There were those who remembered Walton's peculiar behavior in the days leading up to his death. Some claimed that he had been acting strangely, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact with others. He had been seen walking around the village in a trance-like state, muttering to himself. These odd behaviors only fueled suspicions that Walton had somehow become involved in the dark arts. But was there any truth to these rumors? The police, unable to find any concrete evidence of witchcraft, turned their attention to a more earthly suspect, local resident, and longtime acquaintance of Walton, a woman named Mrs. Edith Blower. Mrs. Blower was an elderly widow, known for her sharp tongue and somewhat eccentric personality. She had lived in the village for many years and was well acquainted with Walton. Some villagers had even suggested that there had been a long-standing rivalry between the two, but no one could say for certain what had transpired between them, or why Mrs. Blower might have had a motive to kill Walton. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Mrs. Blower grew increasingly suspicious. She had been seen near the field on the day of Walton's murder, and some villagers reported that she had been heard speaking ill of him in the days leading up to the tragedy. She was questioned by the police, but she denied any involvement in the murder. Despite this, there were whispers that she may have been practicing witchcraft herself, and that Walton's death had been the result of some dark and ancient ritual. These rumors were never confirmed, but they persisted in the village for many years. In the end, no one was ever convicted of Charles Walton's murder. The case was left unresolved, and the mystery of his death has never been fully explained. Was it a ritual killing, tied to some ancient curse or witchcraft? Or was it simply a tragic crime of violence, committed by someone with a personal grudge against Walton? The truth remains elusive. Today, nearly 8 decades after his death, Charles Walton's murder continues to haunt the village of Lower Quinton. His name is still spoken with reverence and unease, as people recall the tragic events of that cold February night. Theories about his death abound, and some still believe that witchcraft was involved. Whether or not there is any truth to these claims remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. The story of Charles Walton is a chilling reminder that some mysteries never truly fade away. In the years since Walton's death, Lower Quinton has grown and changed. Modernity has crept in, and the once stronghold of superstition and rural beliefs has been replaced by more rational and scientific views. Yet, despite this, the memory of Charles Walton's tragic end persists. The village still remembers the quiet man who met his untimely death, and the dark whispers of witchcraft that may have been at the heart of it all. For some, The tale of Charles Walton is a reminder that there are forces in the world that defy explanation, forces that are as ancient and mysterious as the land itself. And perhaps, after all these years, we are no closer to understanding the full truth of what happened that fateful night in 1945.